In 2022, the American public debt surpassed the figure of 30 trillion US dollars. And the most impressive thing about all of this is that this increase shows no signs that it will stop. But how did the United States get into this situation? Let's find out in this video how 7 events in the United States history explain the trajectory of the American public debt over the last 100 years. And how these 7 events were responsible for making the country's debt go from 1 billion US dollars to more than 30 trillion US dollars. But before that, make sure to subscribe to this new channel to see more videos that will cover, analyze, and reveal economic aspects behind countries' successes and failures, and other interesting economic facts from around the world. The United States' economic history is ancient and full of remarkable episodes, including the famous economic crisis. Among various events throughout history, without a shadow of a doubt, we need to understand that 7 events stand out from the others and can be considered the most important ones and essentials to understand the entire American debt history. In this video, you will understand the role of each of these events and how they contributed to make the American debt go from approximately 1 billion US dollars in 1916 to recently surpassing more than 30 trillion US dollars for the first time in history. So let's start. The first most relevant event in chronological order was World War I. According to data from the US Treasury, in 1916 the US public debt was approximately 1.1 billion US dollars and represented only 7.83% of the country's GDP. With the start of World War I in 1914 and government spending on the conflict, the debt quickly raced to over 25 billion US dollars in 1919, and at the end of the war, it reached a record level of approximately 35% of GDP. This was the first big move in American debt since 1900, putting it in 2 digits. With the end of World War I and the recovery of the global economy, the American debt would stabilize until we reached the second event. The second most relevant event in chronological order would be the 1929 crisis. In 1929, the United States and the world would face what would become known as the greatest economic crisis in history. Also called the Great Depression, the 1929 crisis was responsible for the formal beginning of the ideas and public policies to expand government spending to help economies and countries get out of the crisis. And the practical result of this was the beginning of the lack of the control and increase in the country's public debts. According to data from the 1929 US Treasury report, the US debt in that year was approximately 16 billion US dollars and represented 16.34% of the country's GDP. With the end of World War I, the United States became the largest economy in the world, and due to the heating of its economy, the country's public debt fell from 35% of GDP in 1919 to 16.34% in 1929. This economic power spread euphoria to financial markets through the stock exchange and stocks. Financial speculation took over the country at the time. However, unregulated credit and the growth of financial speculation created a bubble of false prosperity that was on the edge of a precipice. Society became incapable of realizing what was about to happen. On the 24th of October 1929, reality appeared. In what became known as Black Thursday, the New York stock market crashed, bringing panic in the financial market and in the country. And from that day on, the 1929 crisis would begin. To get an idea of the country's collapse, according to Federal Reserve data, the country's unemployment rate, which was about 0.04% in August 1929, would reach over 25% in 1933. In the following years, the crisis would only get worse and drag everyone along with it. With the worsening of the economic crisis, in 1933 President Roosevelt would initiate a broad program of public expenditures to reactivate the economy, implementing among other measures several public works and the establishment of the minimum wage. This program became known as the New Deal. The program lasted until 1937 and was responsible for the largest public effort and expenditure up to that time, taking the American public debt from 16 billion US dollars in 1929 to approximately 35 billion US dollars in 1937. Debt to GDP would rise from 16.34% in 1929 to 39.64% in 1937, more than doubling. This was then the second event responsible for the increase in the American public debt. The third event would take place in 1939 with the beginning of World War II. According to data from the US Treasury, the country's public debt would increase from approximately $41 billion in December 1939 to approximately $278 billion in December 1945. In other words, in 6 years, the US debt would multiply by almost 7 times and reach the value of 121% of GDP. Despite all this increase in debt, with the end of World War II, the United States would consolidate itself once and for all as the world's greatest economic power. And so we come to the fourth event, the Bretton Woods meeting. Still in 1944, when World War II was approaching its end, the main economies held the Bretton Woods Conference, with the central objective of reviewing the global financial system. With Bretton Woods, the United States gained control over a large part of the world economy and the entire international financial system. The financial system that would emerge from Bretton Woods would be largely favorable to the United States, with the first step being the transformation of the dollar into the reference currency for the international financial system. And the second step would be setting the gold standard. The United States would price gold at approximately $35 per troy ounce, and implicitly all currencies would be pegged to the dollar. Thus, it was guaranteed to any individual, company, or government that the United States would supply the amount of gold equivalent to the amount of dollar presented following this conversion rate. In the following years, with the end of World War II, and with the economic boom that would follow, the United States public debt would reach the value of $391 billion in 1970. However, this value would once again represent only 34.5% of the GDP of the United States due to economic growth. At this moment, we got to the fifth event, the end of the gold standard in 1971. After years of prosperity, American supremacy would begin to crack. Among other factors, we can cite competition from economies such as Japan, expenses arising from the dispute with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and expenses from the Vietnam War. All of this would make the country have increasingly constant budget deficits and trade balance imbalances, and consequently having to print more dollars to keep its commitments. Thus, the belief in the guarantee of conversion between gold for the dollar was increasingly losing strength. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon, in a statement, definitely broke with the gold standard and its convertibility to the dollar established at the Bretton Woods Convention. From that year onwards, all the backing in the dollar and in other currencies would only depend on the trust of the people and countries in the currency. That is, the currency would become a fiat money or fiat currency. From that moment, there would be no more limits to the printing of money by the US government, since there would be no need to have a gold backing to support the amount of dollars in the economy. The practical consequence of this is that the US debt, which in December 1970 was $391 billion would increase to $4.9 trillion in December 1995. That is, if in the previous 25 years the American debt had risen 40%, in the following 25 years, between 1970 and 1995, it would rise more than 1,250%, or 12.5 times. And that year, it would reach the mark of 65% of GDP. However, this value would still be exceeded in the sixth event, and the sixth most relevant event would be the subprime crisis of 2008. Moving forward in the following years, the American debt would reach the figure of $9 trillion in December 2007, on the eve of what would be known as the second biggest economic crisis in world history until then, behind only the Great Depression of 1929. In 2008, the subprime crisis would take place. This crisis would shock the world again and bring unprecedented changes in government debts. The 2008 crisis would affect the entire global financial system and start the biggest money printing scheme in history. In the following years, the US debt would rise from $9 trillion in December 2007 to $23 trillion in December 2019. That's right. The negative effects of the 2008 crisis on the US economy would still last until 2019. The increase in public debt would be so large and fast that the US debt would surpass the 100% of GDP mark in 2012, and reached the level of 108% in December 2019. Before we discuss the last event, don't forget to leave a like for the video so that we can bring you more content. Also, if you're interested, check the links below to see how to start your online business as I did. The seventh and last most relevant event would be the 2020 crisis. In 2020, still recovering from all the money and debt printing since 2008, the US and the world would suffer the most devastating economic crisis since 1929 and 2008. To give you an idea, the American unemployment rate would experience the biggest and fastest increase in its history. It would go from 3.5% to 14.7% in just 2 months. And again, the government's response would be to print more money and create more debt in order to meet the expenses arising from the global health crisis. With that, the US public debt would increase by 57% and surpass the 120% mark of GDP, having reached the record level of 135%. It is really shocking to see the size of the debts that countries and governments are generating, and as shown throughout the video, the trend is always getting worse and worse. Well, now that you know more about the 100 years of US public debt history and how it went from $1 billion to over $30 trillion, help this channel by saying what other countries or economic subjects you'd like us to analyze. Leave your answers in the comments below, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our new channel for new videos where we will cover, analyze, and reveal economic aspects behind countries' successes and failures, and other interesting economic facts from around the world. Oh, and don't forget to activate the bell to stay on top of the news on this channel. We'll see you in the next one. Until then,